What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Watching the Men of the Week, the series where we watch the people who are playing the Magic Online challenges, who are watching the people watching the people watching the people playing, watching the people watching the metagame. And what that means is we're going to take a look at the Modern, Standard, and Pioneer challenges over the weekend. We're going to take a look and see what happened in terms of metagame breakdowns, what won all the challenges, and then at the very end of each segment, we're going to look at some deck lists. Now, I will say I am recording this on Tuesday, the 11th of November, and yesterday there was a ban announcement. Now, what does that mean for this week's episode? Well, the challenges that we are going to be looking at do not feature the bans. Now, that's because, well, bans happen on Monday, challenges happen on the weekend. Now, I will say I got a little treat for you guys coming up in the standard section. You're going to have to stay tuned to find out. But the good news is there were no changes in Modern, so let's go ahead and start with Modern as we always do. So we had a conversation last week about Jeskai Blink, where Jeskai Blink was at 23.2% of the metagame, and that was pretty scary. Now it looks like the people have kind of come back to reality, and we're back down to 12.5% Jeskai Blink, just barely edging out Boros Energy for the most played deck, and that is sort of a more realistic and healthy number. Now, I did mention this last week. I said that the rise of Jeskai Blink was mostly just because of its performance in Houston. Not to say that it's a bad deck or anything, but for a deck like that to be 23+% of the metagame is just something that's not going to happen every single week. There might be some surges in weeks where it does have that kind of performance. As you can see here, the challenge winners were 2 by Ruby Storm and then 1 each of Boros, Domain, Goryo's, Jeskai Blink, and Neobrand. As far as the metagame itself, looking pretty good. Jeskai Blink and Boros Energy kind of neck and neck for first and second place. Domain Zoo actually had a bit of a resurgence this past weekend. There was actually one challenge that Domain Zoo I think had like 8 or 9 in the top 32, and that was the bulk of where that large percentage, that large increase is coming from. But had a pretty good weekend. Affinity hanging in there is about the same. Is it Prowess, a little up from last week. Ruby Storm, roughly about the same. Amulet Titan, 4.9%. That's, I wish it was less than that, but, you know, people are going to play Amulet. Azorius Control, bit of a huge downtick here from 4.5 to almost non-existent. I think that has to do with its relatively poor Jeskai Blink matchup, combination of card advantage with Riddler, Cheap Threats in Ragavan, and Teferi. Kind of a tough sledding for a control deck. And then everything else, nothing too crazy here. The Simic Ritual deck down a little bit, or actually, sorry, up a little bit, 2.7 to 3.6, my bad. Mono Blue Belcher is the one that's down a little bit, but no other crazy changes. Etron and Samwise up a little bit. Simic Eldrazi, we're going to be taking a look at a deck list there. That was sort of a new innovation in the Eldrazi camp. So that's what the metagame looks like. Let's see if we can find some deck lists. And deck lists we have found. So the first one we're going to be looking at here is from Matadalade 20 in 17th place. Now, at first glance, this might look like your sort of standard run-of-the-mill affinity deck with Weapons Manufacturing, Thoughtcast, Kappa Cannoneer, Pinnacle Emissary. And for the most part, it is. The reason I wanted to highlight this is there's been a bit of a new resurgence in an old classic in the form of Arcbound Ravager. This is a 2-mana artifact that has modular, and you can sack an artifact to put a counter on it. Now, what is that good with? Well, weapons manufacturing. And with these decks, typically featuring 1 to 2 copies of weapons, pairing it with explosives to pop the munitions, this build is going a little bit more in on weapons, playing the full 4 copies, and then pairing that with Arcbound Ravager as an additional sack outlet. Ravager also kind of wants more zeros, so you're playing 4 Thopters and 4 Memnites. And, well, I guess it's the same number of zeros because we're trimming on crypts and explosives, but the reason you want max Ornithopters is because sometimes what happens is you go Ravager, sack your board, accept the Thopter, sack the Ravager to itself, move the counters on Thopter, kind of like a sort of a classic affinity kill. So to facilitate the max Thopters, we're playing 4 drums, and then, yeah, still has the claws to search off the Saga as a tutorable way to sack munitions tokens. So for the most part, the same, but just wanted to highlight this kind of new addition of Arcbound Ravager into the mix for you affinity mains out there. Now, I did mention we'd be taking a look at Simic Eldrazi, and that's what we have here in front of you from Ash_Oathkeeper in 4th place. Again, a lot of these cards similar to what you've seen in Eldrazi decks before. Temple, Ugin's Labyrinth, Kozilek's Command, that forms kind of the big core of this particular deck list. Bunch of fast mana, Kozilek's Commands. You have the Malevolent Rumbles to find more fast mana or find the payoff, whatever you're missing. Now, the big difference here, I'm calling this a Simic deck. It kind of just is mono green. There's no blue cards in the main, although once we get to the sideboard, you see some consigns. But notably, no Kozilek's returns either. So this is sort of straight Simic or mono green splash consign on the board. The big difference here, we've seen this kind of Ice-Till Explorer manifest over the past couple of weeks, past couple of months, honestly, at this point, where the Eldrazi decks are moving towards more and more copies of Ice-Till. And I think that does make a lot of sense, especially with this particular person playing 4 Emrakuls. I think most people are on 2 or 3, but if you're playing Ice-Till Explorer, it does kind of make sense to play more Emrakuls because you are more likely to mill over more types with Ice-Till, therefore making your Emrakul a lot cheaper. This one is also playing 2 copies of Esper Origins, just in addition to the Malevolent Rumbles, giving you a little bit more ways to put cards into the graveyard, more payoffs for having additional mana. The 4/4, like the flip side of this is pretty good, and just giving you the ability to make a 4/4, find some more mana, things like that. 2 Ghost Quarters and a Bajuka Bog to facilitate the kind of Sowing Mycospawn package here. And yeah, everything else relatively same. 3 Baubles in the main deck, very good against Affinity. But yeah, just kind of a slightly different take on this Eldrazi deck with 4 Ice-Tills, max Emrakuls, and just wanted to highlight this as sort of a different way to build Eldrazi. Now, this isn't necessarily a new deck per se, but we haven't really taken a look at Samwise combo on this series, really, I think ever, or at least it's been a while. So wanted to kind of revisit this deck list here from Awesome Possum, who just missed out on winning a challenge here in 2nd place. Now, the main combo here is you are trying to pair Samwise Gamgee with Cauldron Familiar and a Sacrifice Outlet. Samwise says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, make a food. Familiar says sack a food, bring it back from the graveyard, and then when it ETBs, they lose a life and you gain a life. And then with a sack outlet, you go infinite. Now, what's interesting about this deck list is kind of the tutors, right? Typical creature combo decks are going to have a bunch of ways to find the creatures that set up the combo. This deck is doing that in the form of 4 Court of Calling and 4 Birthing Ritual, both of which very, very powerful tools, specifically Court of Calling, because you can cast this card for effectively free or at a very, very cheap discount by tapping your green creatures, of which you have quite a few. Gilded Goose, Mana Dork that makes a food, helps set up the combo. Samwise, also a green creature. This particular version is actually kind of playing this sort of backdoor Yawgmoth engine with 3 Young Wolf and a Yawgmoth, which you can actually tutor up the Yawgmoths or the 1-drops with, you guessed it, Rituals and Court of Callings. So kind of has that additional sort of plan, I guess plan B, although it sort of synergizes with the plan A. So it's like plan A.5 or something like that. 4 Bowmasters in the main, bit of an interesting statement. I don't know if Bowmasters is necessarily great in the metagame right now, but, you know, if people are playing the Quantum Riddler Jeskai Blink decks, Bowmasters does get a little bit more appealing, so that kind of makes sense there. 1 Pylon as a nice removal spell that has Convoke. Grist, which is tutorable off Court of Calling because it is a creature in your library. You have Safekeeper to protect the combo. So if you're kind of into this sort of creature combo Court of Calling, Birthing Ritual style decks, then this one is certainly one to take a look at. And the last deck I have for you here from Katuo 079595 in 14th place. This is Song of Creation. Now, for people who have never seen this card before, I wouldn't blame you. It's a bit of an odd one. 1 and Teamer, so 4 mana enchantment. You can play an additional land on each of your turns. Whenever you cast a spell, draw 2, and then end step, discard your hand. So, the main important line of text is whenever you cast a spell, draw 2 cards. Now, as you can see, this deck has a lot of 0 mana artifacts. claws, 4 explosives, 4 bauble, 4 amber, 4 opal. Now, a lot of that looks very reminiscent of Affinity, right? So before the Song of Creation decks, people have tried this card in the past, and the goal was just play a bunch of zeros, find a grape shot, and then kill your opponent that way. Well, we've kind of, I guess, a new sophisticated win condition in the form of weapons manufacturing. So what you can do is you can actually play your zeros, draw a bunch of cards, eventually find a weapons, and then every single zero you play after that gets you a munitions token. Now, because you have 4 Mox Amber and 4 Mox Opal, you eventually get to a spot where you play explosives for 0, pop all of your munitions, deal them maybe not the full 20, but even if you don't deal the full 20, you can then endurance all of your stuff back in, play more zeros, draw more cards. So kind of sort of a new win condition with the Song of Creation. Still has the Urza Saga plan to go construct beatdown, doesn't have the Shadow Spear or the boots, but can search up mana or crypt or needle. To facilitate the ambers, we have 4 Tamios and 4 Emrys. Emry makes a ton of sense because you're playing explosives and baubles, as well as the Moxes too, so Emry very powerful with that. You have Rumble, which can find not only Saga to help facilitate the plan B, but Rumble can also find Song of Creation. So a nice little, neat little combo package here, and just utilizing weapons manufacturing as the kill condition. So just wanted to highlight that to kind of show you guys what else is possible with those Mox Opals that you got. So that is going to do it for the modern section. Let us go ahead and switch over to Pioneer. You know, I gotta say, it's a little funny looking at this graph, knowing what we know happened on the ban list yesterday. For those of you who don't know, they did actually make a change to Pioneer, which is kind of funny because I just kind of assumed that they forgot that Pioneer existed. But Heartfire Hero was banned in Pioneer, so this 18.8% mono red mice that you see, probably going to significantly decrease in next week's episode, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, as I mentioned in the intro, these challenges were before the ban list update, so we do have mono red mice kind of in the mix still. But number 1 deck, 18.8%, and that, like I said, probably going to go down next week. Orzhov Monument kind of back up. There was a bit of a weird shift where 2 weeks ago, Monument was approaching 20%. Then the next week, which was last week, down to about 9.4. And now we're back up to 15.6. So I would honestly expect that number to probably increase, where the people who were playing mono red mice probably not going to want to play it anymore without Heartfire Hero, so they're going to look for what is the next best deck. So expect an increase in Orzhov Monument over the coming week and in next week's episode. Rakdos Demons clocking in at 11.3, about the same from last week. Azorius Control 10%, about the same. Phoenix down pretty significantly from 9.4 to 5.6. Other than that, Boros Convoke up a little bit, Celestia Company up a little bit, Scapeshift up a little bit, but nothing crazy in terms of massive metagame shifts. 5 challenges, 2 won by Phoenix, 2 won by Monument, and 1 won by Is It Prowess. So that's the data. Now, as far as deck lists are concerned, I got a couple spicy ones for you. And the first one we're going to take a look at is from Ignotus97 in 15th place. Now, Enigmatic Incarnation is a card that people have been playing in Pioneer basically since inception. Maybe not since inception, but since the printing of Leyline Binding, effectively. And it has always kind of been decent, sort of waxes and wanes in popularity in various metagames. But we haven't really looked at an Enigmatic Incarnation deck in a while, so I wanted to kind of check in and see exactly what people are doing with this deck list. Mostly similar to what these decks have looked like over the past. A couple of new additions in the form of Seamrip as a cheap enchantment that you can later sacrifice to Enigmatic, Pinnacle Starcage, good sweeper. But kind of the main sort of engine here is you want to go Incarnation, sack one of your Impended Overlords, so you can sacrifice. Basically, these things impend for a discount, but when you sacrifice them to Enigmatic, they still count as the mana value in the top right. So for example, if you impend an Overlord of the Hotwoods, you can sacrifice that to go get a 6-drop. which you can get Summon Leviathan. You could just get another Overlord in the Boiler Bilges, Linvala the Preserver for a little bit of life. You can sacrifice your 6-drop to then go get Atraxa, or perhaps an Overlord of the Mistmores. And then the big endgame here is eventually finding Zur to give all your stuff lifelink. Zur can also animate the Leyline Bindings and the Enigmatic Incarnations. So that's sort of the game plan. You have a lot of enchantment removal, like I said, Seam Rips, Nowhere to Runs, Leyline Bindings to kill early creatures, and then eventually you can sacrifice those to go get more powerful things. Kind of topping off with a little Ureni, just in case for some reason you ever want to sacrifice your 7. If you absolutely have to, you can do that. So just an option there as well. Take a look at the sideboard here. There's some Thoughtseize in the sideboard. That's kind of, well, I feel like that's new. But yeah, just wanted to highlight Enigmatic Incarnation because I feel like we haven't seen it in a while. And speaking of decks we haven't seen in a while, how about some Ensoul Artifact? Shout out to Hernan72 in 31st place, which, again, to be fair, for these Pioneer Challenges, 31st place, these tournaments are usually only about 45 to 50 people, so keep that in mind. Maybe not the best performance, but in any case, it's a deck list that got posted, so we're going to look at it. Ensoul Artifact, main combo here is you want to be enchanting Darksteel Citadel to make a 5/5 indestructible. A lot of new kind of sweet printings here in the form of Makti and Itla Sky Snarers, which makes your artifacts and creatures your opponents control enter tapped. Very powerful when you're pairing it with Ensoul Artifact, because if they don't already immediately have a blocker when you play Makti, all of their future blockers are going to enter the battlefield tapped, which means that you guaranteed get one Ensoul hit before they're even allowed to block with it in the first place. Shrapnel Blast, kind of just the classic 2-mana second artifact, deal 5. What's cool about Shrapnel Blast is this particular person is playing 3 Screaming Nemesis in the main deck. So you can sort of set up this Splinter Twin combo where if your opponent's trying to gain some life, you can Shrapnel Blast your own Screaming Nemesis, which you were probably going to just deal them 5 anyways, and then deal them 5 with the Nemesis, giving them the Nemesis emblem. Robber of the Rich, just a cool 2-mana 2/2 haste, got a little bit of reach on it as well. One Kraza, the Swarm is one to make your Ensoul artifacts uncounterable, which is kind of cool. Just an interesting host of 1-ups, right? Like 1 Flood Pits, 1 Inti, kind of just trying a bunch of stuff out. Good interaction, Burst Lightning, Flood Maw, Torch, Shrapnel Blast. Metallic Rebuke is pretty cool in this deck because you have both Voldaren Epicure and Spyglass Siren to make cheap artifacts. Mockingbird can copy the Voldaren Epicures and the Spyglasses. Got a Cryptic Coat and an Extruder. Again, a lot of cool 1-ups here that are, but like I said, probably just trying a bunch of stuff out, seeing what sticks. But yeah, we haven't looked at Ensoul in a while, so I figured it was time to check in and see how they're doing. Now, Pioneer historically is known as decks, the format where the people's standard decks go after they get banned. Well, doesn't necessarily always have to be after they get banned, in the form of Kavero here by Silent Song in 6th place. So for people who haven't seen Kavero in Standard, majority of the time it's paired with Bringer of the Last Gift, where Bringer of the Last Gift says when it enters, if you cast it, basically wrath the board and then reanimate everything else. Vero gives you a discount on that because you're paying 4 mana, you're casting the Kavero, but it's entering the battlefield as a copy of Bringer, so you still get the trigger. The upgrades here from Standard to Pioneer, mainly Stitcher Supplier as a 1-mana graveyard enabler, very, very powerful and cheap card that fills up the graveyard. Also, just a good chump blocker against the aggressive decks, where you can get the ETB mill 3, and then you can chump block with the Supplier to get an additional mill 3. You get some fantastic interaction in the form of Fatal Push and Thoughtseize. Who doesn't love those cards? But as far as upgrades from Standard, that's pretty much it. They're playing Oracle of Tragedy as a draw discard enabler, which is similar to Supplier because it's when it enters the battlefield or dies. So you can get a chump block with the Oracle and then get a second loot out of it. So those are pretty powerful enablers and sort of allows you to be a 2-color deck rather than splash green for cash grab, so on and so forth. So if you're into the Kavero thing in Standard, maybe a good time to give it a shot in Pioneer. And the last Pioneer deck we're going to take a look at here does not feature any creatures. Screenwriter NY in 17th place. Orzhov Control. Now, again, looking at this deck list, a lot of good interaction. Thoughtseize, and there's the Fatal Push. I was like, the Fatal Pushes were hiding on me. I was like, I know they're there somewhere. Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Vanishing Verse, very powerful, just kind of 2-mana catch-all spell, alongside Seam Rip, good sweepers with Day of Judgment. The reason I wanted to highlight this deck list is 4 main deck copies of High Noon, which I really haven't seen anybody try before, but it kind of makes a lot of sense. Very powerful against Mono Red, pretty powerful against Phoenix, good against the Prowess decks. There's probably some other decks that I'm missing that High Noon is good against, but, that is what we're doing. A lot of just a pile of interaction, some Planeswalkers here, 1 Sorin, 2 Wandering Emperors, couple Invoke Despairs, and then just a bunch of Haymaker sideboard cards, but in the main deck with Rest in Peace and High Noon both featured here. Main deck, which is kind of wild. So that is the last Pioneer deck we're going to go ahead and take a look at. Now, Standard is where it gets a little weird, but let's take a look at the metagame. And for one last time, we see Izzet Cauldron on the metagame breakdown. And like I said, next week, we're not going to see it anymore. For those of you who missed the ban announcement, Prophet's Eidetic Memory, Screaming Nemesis, and Vivi Ornithie were all banned in Standard. Now, it's a little awkward because, again, the data that you're looking at features challenges that happened before the bans. That's just kind of the way that everything broke down. Now, I will say, we're not going to spend really much time here. What I do have for you is deck lists. We have 4 deck lists that I want to show you of decks that I think are going to be a lot better moving forward without the presence of Cauldron and Mono Red being taken down a notch, although not unplayable. And then I have a surprise because there was a challenge that happened on the same day as the ban list after the bans went into effect on MTGO, and we're going to take a look at that challenge, like all the top 32 decks, and see what the metagame broke down. So we're going to do that, and we're going to start with some deck lists from last week. And the first deck I want to look at, as far as decks that I think will still be very, very good after the bans, is Synthesizer. A deck that people have been trying it for quite some time now. It's gotten a couple of upgrades over some recent sets, namely Pinnacle Starcage and Cryogen Relic. But the main game plan and the concept has still been the same the entire time. Put Synthesizer into play, maybe even put a second Synthesizer into play, maybe even put a third Synthesizer into play, and then play a bunch of artifacts. Eventually kill your opponent by using Repurposing Bay, sacrificing a 3 to go get the Fire Crystal, which, if you have 2 Synthesizers in play, is going to make 2 constructs and then give them all haste. Now, the one thing I will mention about this deck list, 4 main deck authorities, you probably don't need those anymore, given that there's going to be a lot less Mono Red. Now, I'm not going to say that Mono Red is unplayable, people will still play it, but you probably don't need to be main decking 4 authorities anymore. But yeah, this is a deck that I think is pretty reasonably well positioned moving forward. A deck that has a ton of power in it and a lot of flexibility because you have Repurposing Bay to kind of tutor up a bunch of Silver Bullet artifacts. So keep this one in mind. Another deck that's been putting up some numbers recently that, didn't really suffer any hits on the ban list is Orzhov Pixie. Now, these decks look a lot different than their Esper counterparts from, I would say, probably 5 or 6 months ago, before Hopeless Nightmare got banned. But even after Hopeless Nightmare got banned, people still had tried Esper, and I actually won my RCQ right when the season started with a version of Esper Pixie. And these decks look a little bit different. They're a lot more mid-rangey, and what I mean by that is the curve is much higher. 4 main deck Elegy Acolytes alongside 4 Cosmogran Zenith. Now, it's kind of weird because this deck at first glance doesn't look like the best Cosmogran Zenith deck. Not a lot of 1-drops, relatively high curve. But remember, all of your Pixies and Kirans, which there are 8 of, represent a double spell. Even if you, say you only have 1 card in hand, you have 4 mana, you go Kirin, Bounce Breaker, that's your second spell for Zenith. So Maybe the curve should be lowered a little bit, like maybe you trim the Elspeth, maybe you don't play Overlords, maybe you can trim an Acolyte or something like that, just to lower the curve a little bit. But the concept is still the same, with Nowhere to Run, Momentum Breaker, pair alongside Kieran and Pixie. Very, very powerful shell. So definitely want to keep this one in mind, and I'll probably be trying this one myself a lot. Another deck that we definitely can't forget about is Simic Drunith. This one has, even during the heyday of Cauldron and Mono Red and all that kind of stuff, Simic was kind of creeping up in the metagame share and putting up some pretty decent numbers. And I would not be surprised if this deck continued to put up good numbers, especially without VV or Mono Red around, where this deck is built around playing Drunith with a bunch of cheap creatures, because Drunith can copy all of your cheap creatures. Every single time you play a creature spell, you get a counter on Drunith, and you copy the spell, and then basically you kind of go up the chain with that. If you can get lucky enough to get this thing to 4 power, you can copy Ouroboros, which is as disgusting as you think that sounds. So definitely keep this one on your radar. I'm not sure how much of this is going to change with the removal of VV and the downgrade of Mono Red. Maybe you don't look towards something like main deck Tidebinder. Maybe you don't need the Curators in the main deck because you're not trying to exile the VVs from the graveyard. Perhaps you want to play more Riddlers. Maybe flesh out the playset of Paw Patch recruits. Probably the 4th Drunith as well. So some things to keep in mind, but yeah, this deck definitely going to be a player in the new metagame. And the last deck I want to look at here is, well, one that we kind of just saw in Pioneer, and a deck that I think is poised very, very well in the upcoming new standard metagame, and that is Sultai Kavero. Our enablers are not quite as good as they are in Pioneer, so we do kind of have to play that third color for stuff like Cash Grab, Town Greeter, a sort of a new addition here in the form of Oblivious Bookworm. You may not have never seen this card before. Typically a card that was, I don't know if it was good in Limited because I didn't play much Duskmourn Limited. Let me know in the comments down below. But this card pairs very well with Manifests. Although there is no Manifest in this deck. This is just a 2-mana 2/3 that you can loot every single turn. So 3 toughness is big because it dodges Torch. It dodges a Tragic Trajectory that does not have Void. So that's kind of why you're playing this, and it's a good blocker too. I'm not sure if this card, it's kind of weird because I think a lot of the reason you were playing Bookworm before was that it gave you a loot and then blocked against Mono Red, right? But now that you don't necessarily need the blocker as much, if there's less Mono Red, maybe you go back to more Town Greeters, something like that. The Terror of the Peaks, I think this was mostly here to combo kill against VV, so you didn't give them an extra turn. Probably don't need this one. Although, maybe you want the ability to OTK against the control decks. So, some things to keep in mind in terms of how you're going to be sort of morphing these decks around the fact that there's no more VV and less Mono Red. So, just a lot of things to keep in mind. Now, we've looked at some deck lists that are potentially good post-ban. How about we look at a couple of decks, or the metagame, from the actual challenge after the ban list. All right, we're not going to go through these decks one by one because this video has already been going a lot longer than I expected it to, but this was the first challenge post-bans, won by Jeskai Control. This is what we've kind of seen from Jeskai Control. This is nothing new necessarily, notably not 4-color, right? Some decks are playing the Inevitable Defeat. This version is not playing that. Still has the Authorities main, still worried about Mono Red. You can see here, this is the metagame breakdown. 9 Dimir, which is a lot, but expected because that's what everybody assumes the best deck is going to be post-rotation, post-bans. 9 Other, which is kind of cool. 4 Jeskai Control, 3 Artifacts, and then a whole bunch of one-ofs. Orzhov Bounce, Temur Storm Splitter, Temur Floodcaller, not sure what the difference is there. Yuna, Kona, Gruul Delirium, big shout out to Delirium, and still 1 Mono Red deck, which I'll show you before I let you go. No Screaming Nemesis here, but still playing the Needleheads, which I think is probably unnecessary given that there's no VV Cauldron. I don't know if Needlehead's that good against everybody else, but maybe it's still fine. So yeah, some things to think about moving forward. Just wanted to show you guys all that stuff. But yeah, let me know what you think of the bans. Let me know what you think is going to do well in the post-ban standard metagame. Would love to hear your thoughts, and I'm really excited for next week's episode when we actually get the first weekend of data after the bans. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.